Good morning, humanities students, and welcome to my introduction of the Modernist literary movement, a movement that took place from roughly 1900 to 1950. Now, at the beginning of the 1900s, we had a little something called World War I, and it was incredibly bloody and frightening. Even though the United States did not get involved into the fighting until about 1917, a year before the war ended, they still saw firsthand the carnage and devastation that ravaged Europe. For example, in 1916, 500,000 soldiers died in a 10-long-month battle near Verdun in northeastern France. With the war, there was a loss of innocence on a national level. The optimistic attitudes of the transcendentalists had finally completely dissolved, replaced instead with cynicism and a rejection of the foundations of the past. America was no longer this new Eden of unlimited promise and beauty. In 1919, there was an effort to improve society for the better by targeting alcohol, and it was a movement called Prohibition. However, this effort to ban alcohol backfired and encouraged the creation of speakeasies, which were underground, not literally underground, but sort of inconspicuous places where they illegally sold alcohol, bootleggers, and a large gangster presence. Life during the Roaring Twenties, which came shortly after Prohibition, the next year, was one of economic prosperity, but it was temporary, as people squandered all of that on lavish parties and sinful pursuits. Even with all that money and success, though, some dreams were still largely unattainable. For example, in The Great Gatsby, the novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, we see the character of Gatsby try desperately to pursue a certain dream, not wanting to give away any spoilers or anything, and despite his monetary success and economic power, he struggles to make that dream a reality. At this point, the American dream that the Founding Fathers had built this country on was dying. And so many authors, Fitzgerald included, looked around and said, you know what, I don't really want to be part of the United States anymore. I'm going to pack up and move elsewhere. And that's what they did. It was called the expatriate movement. And it was when authors like T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda, they all packed their bags and they moved to Paris, France, where they could find inspiration in a beautiful place that was free of prohibition laws and incredibly affordable in the aftermath of World War I. Now, at the end of the Roaring Twenties, the United States was hit with another devastating blow in the form of the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression. Millions of Americans were now out of work, forced into the streets and struggling to keep their families fed. Suddenly, the self-reliant individual, championed by Emerson, was a thing of the past. Hard work no longer guaranteed a person's success. During the early 1900s, two big intellectual movements happened. They were called Marxism and psychoanalysis, which I'm sure sounds familiar to all of you. First, let's start with discussing Marxism. Karl Marx was the founder of socialism, and he spurred on the Russian Revolution in 1917. His ideological beliefs, aptly labeled Marxism, were in direct opposition to the American system of capitalism and free enterprise. However, with the lavish lifestyles of the wealthy in the 1920s and the struggles of the poor in the 1930s following the Depression, many were beginning to question the effectiveness of capitalism. During this time, Sigmund Freud was conducting examinations into the minds of his patients, called psychoanalysis. He primarily focused on the unconscious mind and used it to redefine our understanding of human sexuality and subconscious motivations. His theory was that our actions are directly influenced by our unconscious minds, which led to many people asking themselves, hey, wait a second, if my unconscious mind is motivating my actions, how much freedom do I really have? Is there even such a thing as free will? Authors such as William Faulkner and James Joyce tried to tap into their unconscious minds through a narrative writing method known as stream of consciousness, in which thoughts and feelings are presented without interrupting the flow with description or dialogue. So the author simply writes about the character's thoughts, one thought after another thought after another thought after another thought. No interruptions whatsoever, oftentimes ignoring things like punctuation, because hey, who needs that? Typically we think in just run-on sentences anyways. Okay, well, now that we've talked a little bit about some of the historical influences on the modernist period, and we also talked about the influences of psychoanalysis and Marxism on writing styles, let's talk about the writers themselves, since it is English class. There are a number of noteworthy authors that came out of the modernist period. There's the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, who really did a fantastic job sort of helping develop new social, intellectual, and romantic roles for women. She was a very extravagant individual, a definite public figure, and other women saw this and wanted to emulate her, wanted to adopt her confidence and her charisma. There was Sinclair Lewis, who looked at small-town American life that up until this point was seen as being, super sweet and all that, and he lashed out at it and pointed out a lot of its flaws and issues. Theodore Dreiser wrote An American Tragedy, which was a story about an ambitious individual who unfortunately did not have much luck, and in his course of trying to become successful, he ends up in an execution room. There's also Ernest Hemingway, who is by far one of my favorite authors, especially out of this time period.
What are you writing?
Novel.
About what?
It's about a man who works in a nostalgia shop.
What the hell is a nostalgia shop?
You know, a place where they sell old things, memorabilia. And does that sound terrible?
No subject is terrible if the story is true, if the prose is clean and honest, and if it affirms courage and grace under pressure.
You know, can I ask you the biggest favor in the world? No.
What is it?
Would you read it?
Your novel.
Yeah, it's like 400 pages long, and I'm just looking just for, just an opinion.
My opinion is I hate it.
I mean, you haven't even read it.
If it's bad, I'll hate it because I hate bad writing. If it's good, I'll be envious and hate it all the more. You don't want the opinion of another writer.
He was also labeled as the most influential of all the post-World War I authors. He wrote in plain style and tried to get rid of all this extravagance and flowery language that was used by previous authors. His hero, in terms of his stories, the heroes in his stories, were usually men of action. They were warriors who followed their own code and moral compass, driven by honor. And they showed, and this is a quote by Hemingway, grace under pressure. However, Hemingway did still share the cynicism of some of his colleagues in the literary world, and he questioned what lay at the center of life. As a result, his heroes, despite being sort of courageous and admirable, they were always disillusioned with either themselves or what life could offer them, so they were a little bit lost. And according to Hemingway, the way he saw life was that you were given small little moments of happiness, right? And other than that, life was pretty sad and miserable. But it was your job to snatch up those moments of happiness and savor them and enjoy them while they were there. Poetry, as a whole, kind of died a little before the modernist period, and it went away following the success of Whitman and Dickinson in the late 1800s, who I know we haven't talked about yet, but that's okay. We'll go back in time in second semester and talk about those two poets. But poets did eventually emerge, inspired by painters such as Picasso and Matisse, who were sort of experimenting with different ways of viewing the world. And so poets thought, hey, I'm going to view the world differently too, and sort of break down traditional poetic conventions and sort of create my own type of poetry. T.S. Eliot adopted a technique called symbolism, which is a word we throw around quite a bit, while Ezra Pound used a practice called imagism, which involved using clear, sharp language to isolate a single image and explain it in incredible detail. So these were all very new, fresh ideas on how to write poetry. Now, Robert Frost, who was a big name in American poetry, he rejected the whole modernist movement. Instead, he took those conventional poetic structures from the 1800s and such, like rhyming systems and things, and he just put his own personal spin on them, make them his own. To him, new wasn't necessarily synonymous with good. There was also Edgar Lee Masters, who was a poet out of the Midwest, represent Midwest, and in his Spoon River anthology, he desentimentalized small-town life and used the ghost of these people who died in Spoon River to sort of explain about the greed and corruption that was in their small town. Finally, the push for change and new styles led to new rhythms of the Jazz Age, and African Americans finally found a way to express themselves through poetry and jazz. Langston Hughes was one of the major poets responsible for sparking the Harlem Renaissance, which was a huge movement that began in Harlem, in Manhattan, and then spread to other corners of the United States. What the Harlem Renaissance sought to do was to give a voice to African Americans who, up until this point, were kind of shuffled off into the margins of the artistic community and sort of ignored. This was giving them a voice and a presence in the artistic world. Finally, since we've done this for every single literary movement so far, I think it's important to take what we discussed and establish the basic criteria of a modernist work of literature. So firstly, modernist literature often rejects tradition and it encourages experimentation, trying new things. Whether they be poets or novelists, they were all trying something different. Even Robert Frost, who took classic poetic conventions, still put his own personal spin on things. Second, there's often a loss of faith in the American dream. Okay, as mentioned earlier, this shift toward pessimism was prompted by the devastation of World War I, the materialism and excess of the Roaring Twenties, and also the struggles of the Great Depression. Thirdly, modernist literature often contains a flawed hero who soldiers on despite the trials, and in the words of Hemingway, demonstrates grace under pressure. Finally, the last major characteristic of modernist literature is that the literature shows an interest in the inner workings of the human mind, inspired by a lot of the psychological discoveries and theories of Sigmund Freud during this time period.